The state plays monopoly. The state creates and sustains the exploitative class through monopolies and subsidies, transferring wealth to unproductive elites and protecting them against the pressure exerted by others who want to provide people with the goods and services they offer less expensively. Over the short term, a particular firm can become dominant in a particular environment and perhaps even succeed in attempts to squeeze other firms out entirely. Over the long term, however, such a firm will tend to grow fat and lazy and to extract monopoly profits. At that point, members of the public will tend to try to obtain the goods and services it offers from others who serve them more efficiently. As a result, its monopoly position won't last for long. At least that's what would happen if other firms actually could provide the same kinds of goods and services to the same customers as the monopolist. But the picture is very different if the state steps in, threatening to use force against those who offer people the same kinds of goods or services the monopolist does. If the state can prohibit others from doing the same kind of work as the monopolist can stay fat and lazy, and it can continue to exploit ordinary people, growing rich at their expense. The state is itself a monopolist, as I've already suggested. It seeks to maintain a monopoly over the use of force. That may sound like a noble goal. After all, who wants everyone to be violent? But the state uses its monopoly position to support other monopolies. It operates some, like the U.S. Postal Service, directly. 19th century American anarchist Lysander Spooner famously fell afoul of the U.S. government when he tried to deliver mail. The Congress deliberately and ruthlessly put him out of work. More frequently, it grants monopoly privileges to privileged elites and their businesses. On occasion, it does this because some state actors genuinely believe that ordinary people will be better off if the state creates or maintains a monopoly in this or that sector of the economy. More often, however, the state actors say they're serving the public good while actually benefiting their cronies and keeping prices high by suppressing alternatives. The state creates monopolies of all different kinds. Most fundamentally, of course, in addition to its own claimed monopoly over the use of force, it claims the right, in effect, to create further monopolies at will. It says, in effect, that it has a kind of residual monopoly power. But more specifically, it consistently confers monopoly privileges of several especially important varieties. Patents and copyrights. For instance, without the state, there clearly would be no patents. A patent prevents you from making something I've made, even if you arrive at your understanding of the relevant process, chemical compound, or whatever, utterly independently of my own parallel discovery, and even if you use your own physical possessions to make it. Because I convince the state that I deserve it, the state gives me the privilege, in effect, to stop you from working. Conveniently, the state will do the needed dirty work for me. Patent rights allow pharmaceutical companies, for instance, to extract enormous profits from ordinary people. Contrary to popular opinion, patents aren't necessary to spur productivity. Agreements requiring people not to disclose secret information could obviously provide some of the protections patents do. For instance, though they would never be able to prevent people from independently developing products or processes. But even without patent protection, an innovator would often have good reason to want to be the first to offer a given product or process. Copyrights, too, are fiat creations of the state. The authors of the U.S. Constitution apparently thought it was obvious that giving authors monopolies over, quote, their respective writings would, quote, promote the progress of science and useful arts, unquote. But copyrights now extend well beyond creators' deaths, conferring rights far more extensive than anyone might reasonably expect to be necessary to incentivize creative work. Copyrights aren't needed to ensure that such work is completed. People publish books and write music for reasons quite unrelated to the desire for financial gain. Point-of-sale agreements could obviously require indemnification for losses due to copying creative works for commercial purposes, though these would need to involve more deliberate assent on the part of the purchaser than do contemporary shrink-wrap contracts. And writers and artists could offer buyers a variety of reasons to purchase their creations from them rather than from copiers. Copyrights aren't essential to the vitality of the creative process. They are the creations of the state that allow for pointless prosecutions of adolescent music fans and for the extraction of monopoly profits by media businesses. Immigration restrictions. Immigration restrictions discriminate against workers on the basis of their national origin. Sometimes they reflect a visceral distaste for people from other societies, and it's obvious that they disadvantage people from other communities who want to work by keeping them from working even when there's genuine demand for their work. But a state's immigration restrictions also obviously harm those already under the state's jurisdiction who want the services provided by workers from other communities. Thus, these monopolistic restrictions, which privilege some people while excluding others, reduce the economic well-being of workers from other communities and of the state's own subjects. Licenses. The state consistently demands that people not perform many kinds of work without its permission. Enforcing licensing requirements is often an exercise in petty tyranny, as when an official in Tulare, California shut down a little girl's lemonade stand because it didn't have a business license. But even when licensing requirements don't prompt the same kind of public outcry, they persistently impede people's ability to work. They raise barriers to entry and boost the profits of people with licenses. New York cab operators, for instance, enjoy oligopoly profits because of the limits on entry into taxi driving work imposed by city licensing requirements. So do physicians. Think of how many routine medical services could be performed by nurses, nurse practitioners, or technicians of various kinds if licensing requirements didn't get in the way. Because physicians are the only ones who can perform these services, they can demand high prices from patients. It never fails to amaze me when debates about reducing healthcare costs fail to focus on the contributions made to these costs by licensing requirements. Lawyers are often able to command extremely high fees, too, because licensing limits the provision of basic legal services by non-lawyers. State-created and state-maintained licensing requirements create monopolies that shunt wealth to privileged licensees. Licensing requirements make it costlier to work because acquiring or retaining a license may require someone to purchase and maintain expensive equipment. For instance, health and safety or zoning rules might prevent someone from operating a small bakery in their own home. Legal requirements might limit legitimate bakeries to those employing large ovens it's economical to use only by a large bakery. These rules keep someone without the money or time to acquire and operate a relatively large facility away from her home from operating a bakery. Thus, they work against startups and people without money, and so tend to protect established producers and people with money against the pressure exerted by poorer upstarts. pro-business regulation. State officials often maintain that various laws and regulations are designed to protect the public from business interests. And doubtless, protecting the public really is the goal of some people who support regulations of various kinds. But the reality is that regulations often serve primarily to reduce the pressure to which big businesses are often subjected by upstarts. And this is going to be true as long as the state does the regulating, since legislatures and regulatory bodies can easily be captured by the private interests they are designed to regulate. Companies with extra cash in their pockets have money to spend on lobbying and bribery. And all companies are likely to be much more interested in focusing on laws and regulations related to their operations than almost anyone else. Thus, they will be much better equipped to influence the development of such laws and regulations than most members of the general public, or, indeed, most legislators and their staff members. In addition, whatever the content or motivation of regulations, large, established firms will likely find it easier to spend what's needed to comply with new regulations, while smaller upstarts won't. So it's no surprise that when laws and regulations constraining businesses are adopted, they often work out to the benefit of large firms and to the detriment of small ones. Thus, progressive-era regulations, sold to the public as designed to protect consumers from big business, actually serve to protect business from competition at consumers' expense. Similarly, the industrial cartels created at the beginning of the 1930s offered precisely what large businesses had been demanding during the two preceding decades. Industry leaders had tried to impose rules on other firms that would reduce the amount of pressure established players felt from mavericks and upstarts. As long as those rules were voluntary, they were often ignored, and lower prices and greater responsiveness benefited the public. So regulatory programs were designed to turn these rules into legal requirements, thus allowing the big players to continue comfortably producing goods and services with unnecessarily high prices, while subjecting businesses that serve the public more effectively to sanctions designed to make them fall in line. What passes for state regulation in the public interest often undermines public well-being. Another example: regulations that no one can understand or implement without acquiring specialized expertise and spending a lot of money effectively limit the number of people who can even think of producing, for instance, medical devices. It's certainly costly to design and build such devices, but it's often even more costly to comply with the relevant regulations. They increase startup costs significantly, which means that few people can even think of developing new products. Their effect, therefore, is to protect existing players and a limited number of new ones with lots of money. Money. The state characteristically insists on monopolizing the issue of money. Anarchists disagree about the extent to which people would need money in a stateless society. But an essential anarchist conviction is that if an activity is appropriate, the state shouldn't be able to monopolize it. By monopolizing the issue of money, the state can manipulate the money supply. It often does so deliberately, as for instance when it pays its war-related debts with newly created money. If these debts are paid as soon as the money is created, the state's creditors may get value for money. Over time, however, the effects of the increased money supply are felt throughout the economy, with the result that existing money diminishes in value. Without announcing a new tax, the state has effectively committed robbery as a way of funding its war efforts. If multiple currencies were in circulation, they could be exchanged just as national currencies are now. However, because people could choose sound over unsound currencies, the effect of arbitrary currency expansion would be minimized. People could respond to changes in the value of particular currencies by choosing to transact in others, and there would be ongoing pressure on those various entities that issued currency to seek stability. Leaving banks free to issue their own currency against their own assets would tend to ensure sound money, since if currency could circulate freely and be exchanged freely, exchange rates would shift in light of changes in the actual value of the assets backing the money. While in the past, concealing the relevant information might have been relatively easy, Internet-based exchange mechanisms could make exchanges among multiple currencies rapid and relatively inexpensive, and the possibility of exchange would tend to enable people quickly to avoid bad money and opt for good. But the opportunity of transacting in multiple currencies isn't available. Because the state maintains a money monopoly, it is able to exercise enormous and often destructive power over people's economic lives, limiting their options while forcing them to use currency it creates and manipulates to the advantage of political elites. Banking and credit. Banking and the issue of credit are effectively monopolies too. The state determines what conditions a business needs to meet in order to qualify as a chartered bank. Legal rules typically require a business to have sizable capital reserves in order to qualify as a bank, and they often permit a bank to be chartered in a given area only if it can show that it's needed, and whether it's needed is assessed in part in light of its likely impact of the profits on other banks. The other banks are frequently quite capable of influencing chartering decisions. These rules serve to protect not the public, but rather existing banks. If capitalization and other requirements are eliminated so that small banks could be easily founded, the proliferation of banks, each interested in attracting depositors, would tend to drive down interest rates. Banks with limited reserves might pose some risks for depositors, but as long as fraud wasn't involved, depositors would be free to choose risk options that worked for them. Small banks could include mutual banks. When they engage in mutual banking, people pledge their own resources to a cooperative venture that can issue currency against the pledged resources of whatever sort, land, commodities, etc. This kind of cooperative bank would be unlikely to charge its members' interest above the very small amount needed to fund its own operations. The availability of alternatives would see to that. By contrast, because the state places limits on who can offer banking and credit services, the current banking sector enjoys a collective de facto monopoly. The cartelization of the banking industry allows banks to extract monopoly profits from an unwilling public. And because of FDIC guarantees, which are effectively subsidies, banks may often see little need to maintain more reserves than they're required to by law or to identify creative ways to meet customers' needs.